Hi everyone. So for this last section of Chapter 4 on attention, we're going to talk about how attention allows us to experience our world as one continuous experience rather than individual things. So attention doesn't only allow us to identify objects and things in our environment, but it also helps us to bind things together so it's all one experience. So here you see the individual looking at the ball rolling down the ramp. So during the binding process, um, our attention allows us to combine different features such as color and form and motion together so we can perceive it as one coherent object and we don't actually experience the rolling motion separate from the shape of the ball or the color from the ball. So multisensory integration means the binding between the senses is also something that we experience and that attention influences. So this means that binding has to occur between the senses but also within them. So for instance, if you're going down to the cafeteria and you pick up a hamburger, right, the hamburger smells and feels the same. You know it's the same sandwich that you're smelling and feeling and potentially tasting. So we do know that we have some multisensory neurons in the brain. They're located in the superior colliculus in the midbrain. And we also know from research that the multisensory experience increases with experience because the connections in the cortex actually increase. So we do know that we have those neurons present at birth, but they actually become more sophisticated or more experienced as we get older. So it's something that's present at birth, but with experience, it gets better, right? And that probably reminds you of when we talked about top-down processes. So initially, when you see something for the first time, it's a bottom-up process, but then when you use your prior experience to guide what you're seeing, it's considered a top-down process. And really having that ability allows us to differentiate between whether we heard something or felt something or saw something. And we typically do have that knowledge, but if we're actually experiencing something, we experience it all at once. Okay, so Treisman came up with the feature integration theory, also called FIT, and it consists really of two stages. So we have the pre-attentive stage and then the focused attention stage. So we have during the pre-attentive stage, we analyze an object into features, and that typically occurs automatically, so it doesn't require any effort or attention. Really, for the most part, right? If I asked you if you're doing this, you wouldn't have been able to tell me yes or no because we are largely unaware of this process occurring. And during this stage, really, we analyze objects into their features. Once that process is completed, right, our focused attention allows us to combine the features and therefore we perceive it as one continuous experience. So this was a really interesting study that was conducted by Treisman and Schmidt to actually see what happens during times of high perceptual demands. So they were studying illusory conjunctions. An illusory conjunction is basically a perceptual error. So they did a visual task where they wanted to demonstrate that under certain conditions, when an individual is unable to pay attention for a brief moment, the binding process can actually fail. So they were kind of artificially trying to create this situation. So during this experiment, participants saw these slides. So they were similar to the one that you're seeing right now. So they would show these displays for a very brief duration, usually 200 milliseconds, followed by a masking slide with a dot array. And then following the presentation of the display, they asked participants to report the black numbers first and then the shapes at each location. And what they observed was that participants reported illusory correlations on approximately 1/5 of the trials. So, for instance, for the example that you're seeing right now, they may have reported seeing a small green triangle for the display shown here, rather than actually reporting that they saw a large blue triangle and a small green circle. So they're basically combining features of both these objects. They're in a similar location, so they're combining features of both objects and reporting that they see a small green triangle. So as I said, right, this is kind of a lab situation where they're trying to get people to make these perceptual errors because they're showing them these displays for a very short amount of time. But obviously, this also occasionally happens in the real world when we're being distracted. Sometimes binding doesn't occur or it doesn't occur properly. So a real world example would be, let's suppose that you're meeting several new people in a short amount of time. And when somebody asks you, who did you just meet? What did they look like? You might report, maybe combining features of 2 or 3 different people and actually saying, the person you're reporting seeing one person that kind of consisted of the different features of the people that you saw. So saying that, even though the person had, a different hair color, you're reporting it falsely because you're combining it with another person that you saw. So obviously, attention plays an important role in binding. However, there are some circumstances where binding actually occurs without attention. Some examples would be, for instance, when you're swatting a fly, right? It doesn't really require you to pay attention, right? We already talked about that's the difference between the dorsal and the ventral stream. One's in charge of survival, and the other one is in charge of visual perception. So swatting a fly or moving your hand from the fire doesn't really require any attention, right? It's something that happens automatically. But for the most part, in everyday life, we do need attention to perceive things and to also experience them as one continuous experience. So, we already talked about that we have the multisensory neurons in our brain that allow us to bind information. So we also know that binding takes place in mostly the parietal lobes. The parietal lobes are in charge of processing sensory perception in general. And there is some evidence from individuals with Balin syndrome that the parietal lobes do play an important role in binding. So looking at patients with Balin syndrome, so this syndrome was first identified in 1909 by Rezo Balin, so it's named after him. And it's really an extreme form of visual neglect caused by damage to both parietal lobes. And really what happens in an individual who has this, they're unable to direct their eyes to an object, and they're unable to accurately reach for things. So they really are unable to see the entire picture. So similar to somebody who has visual neglect, they're ignoring part of the world. An individual with Balin syndrome can't bind the experience together. So sometimes you actually see that the person can't reach for an object. When they try to bend down to tie their shoes, they consistently reach a foot over from where their shoe is. Also, something that's quite curious is that if an individual wears glasses, they can't actually see the person behind the glasses because for us, right, it's one continuous experience that you see the glasses and the person behind them. But because they can't bind the experience, they only see the glasses but not the person behind the glasses anymore. Typically, Balin syndrome is caused by head trauma, also sometimes by tumors or neurodegenerative disease such as Alzheimer's disease. It can also be the result of a stroke that affected the parietal lobes in the brain. So I have a quick video for you to get an idea of what Balin syndrome actually looks like.
Grab it with that hand.
I can't do it.
Can you see it?
I can see it, but I can't tell it. like how you reach it.
You seem to do better with your left hand. And take a crack at it up here, if I hold it up closer. All right, how about now that you've touched it with that hand, can you reach with the other hand and grab it? With your right hand?
With my right hand?
Uh-huh.
I have.
If I wiggle it, does moving it help you at all?
Nah, well.
Yeah, it does a little bit. So motion sort of pulls you toward it, like.
Okay, so we're going to return to our slides. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the feature integration theory. So as we already talked about, for the most part, the feature integration theory proposes that most of the information is processed bottom up, meaning that we're starting with what we're seeing and then we work our way up. But on occasion, right, if we already have experience with something, we use a top-down process. So obviously, prior experience does influence how we perceive things because we can sometimes use that information from a prior experience to interpret what we're seeing. So if we're told ahead of time what we're going to see, it's gonna change how we perceive things because we know what to expect. So kind of tying this chapter in with our previous chapter that we talked about on cognitive neuroscience. So we do know that attention enhances neural responding. So certainly there's various places in the brain that are associated with attentional processes. We learned that the parietal lobes are crucial for the binding experience, but there's not one individual area in the brain that we've identified where we would be able to say this is where attention takes place because it seems to be really distributed across a large number of areas in the brain. But we do know that there are some individual parts of the brain that are associated with binding and also with paying attention in general. All right, so this concludes Chapter 4.